I'll now call to order this virtual meeting, the Planning Advisory Committee. I will begin reading the land acknowledgement statement. On May 26, 2022, we acknowledge that this sacred land on which Smith Falls is now located, site of human activity for over 10,000 years, and is rich in Indigenous history. This land is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We are grateful to the Algonquin ancestors who cared for the land and water in order that we might meet here today. We are also grateful for the Algonquin people for the contribution in making of the Rideau Canal, which runs through Smith Falls. We are mindful of the broken covenants and the need to reconcile with all our nation relations. Together may we care for this land and each other, drawing on the strength of the mutual history of the nation, building through peace, friendship, being mindful of generations to come. All participants are asked to keep their microphones on mute, cameras off during staff and consultant presentations. There will be an opportunity for the committee members and the public to ask questions following the presentation this evening. If you have not signed in with the recording secretary, please speak now. I am John Wanless, Chair of the Planning Advisory Committee. I will now take attendance of the committee members and staff. Please raise your hand or declare your presence when I call your name. Bill Widmeyer.
Here.
Councillor Jay Brennan.
Present.
Stephen McGuire.
Present.
Senior Planner Carl Grenke.
Present.
Planning Clerk Mary Remick.
Present.
To review, committee members are asked to raise their hand when they wish to speak. Alternatively, please find an appropriate opportunity at any available time to notify the chair verbally if you wish to speak. We'll now move to our agenda. Item number 2, approval of the agenda. Can I have a motion? Moved by Jay, seconded by Bill. All in favor? Carried. Item number 3, adoption of minutes. We don't have any. Disclosure of monetary interests. We'll now move to the public portion of the meeting. I'll now open the public meeting portion of the Planning Advisory Committee meeting. Please be advised that you may leave this meeting at any time. The purpose of the statutory public meeting is to provide an opportunity for all members of the community to be involved in the zoning bylaw review project and provide input. Input received will help finalize the new draft zoning bylaw before presenting to council. Individuals logged in to participate in this public open house are asked to please keep their microphones on mute and cameras off until question and answer portion of the presentation. I will now pass the meeting over to our senior planner, Carl Grenke, to give a brief overview of the project and introduce the consultant team at WSP, who have prepared a presentation giving an overview of the prepared draft zoning bylaw and outline of the key changes in the document. There will be an opportunity for questions from the committee and the public participants following the presentation. Carl?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening, committee, and as well as those who are joining us virtually and watching the public meeting. This evening is the statutory public meeting to consider a draft comprehensive zoning bylaw. It is a project that the town has retained WSP Canada Inc. Planning consultants to assist us with over the last year or so, and the objective is to replace our current 1994 zoning bylaw with a new zoning bylaw that includes new zoning categories, updated definitions, and general provisions. So I'd like to introduce Justina Garbos from WSP, and she's prepared a presentation that she will be delivering to the committee this evening. So Justina, please go ahead.
Thank you, Carl, and good evening, panel members. Mary or IT, could you go? I see slides coming up. That's great. While that's getting going, I'll just reintroduce myself. Justina Garbos. I'm a senior planner with WSP and also a registered professional planner. So I'm here tonight on behalf of the team that's been working on the zoning bylaw update. So my colleagues who are not in attendance tonight, but have taken a very active part in this project include Nadia DeSanti, as well as Jill McDonald. Next slide, please. So as Carl mentioned, the purpose of today's statutory public meeting is to provide you with an overview of the final draft of the comprehensive zoning bylaw and summarize the key changes to it that have been made since the last version was shared both online as well as to this committee back in March. And I will go through some of the issues that were raised through comments and how we've addressed those. So the second objective of tonight's meeting is to gain further input into this latest draft, answer any of your questions, and then finally to explain the next steps in our process and how members of the public can continue to be involved. Next slide. So just quickly going through our agenda, I will provide an overview of the project itself, what was involved in getting us to this point in time. I'll provide an overview of the final draft of the zoning, the key changes that we've made since March, how issues that have come up were addressed, and whatever any outstanding changes we may have before the final document is presented to council for adoption. So that will cover the first part of the presentation. Second half being a question and answer period. So any panel members or members of the public may provide input at that time. And then once we've exhausted all of those Q&As, we'll get into the next steps. So how to move this document through to final adoption. And in case anyone logged in a little late, just a quick note that this is being a recorded meeting. So if you know of anyone who is unable to attend tonight's meeting, they can see the recording on YouTube. And that link is also available on Speak Up Smiths Falls. Next slide. So this flow chart here provides a summary of what work has been done to date and where we are today. So the yellow star above spring 2022 is where we are today, into the final phase of the project. Where we started was back in summer 2021. And as far as how the review took place, there was some initial background study and review, which included a public engagement event, so a zoning issues workshop, and that led to the development of a discussion paper. Following that, into the fall of 2021, we defined what approach we wanted to take as far as updating this 94 document. There was a meeting to present that approach at council, and the deliverable coming out of that meeting was a zoning strategy report, so kind of a guiding document for the update itself. And then through the fall into this past winter, we worked on a draft, and that was presented to the Planning Advisory Committee at a meeting back in late March, and it was considered to be our statutory open house under the Planning Act, similar to tonight's meeting. So that resulted in the March 11th draft zoning bylaw. So subsequent to that meeting, there were some questions, comments that came from PAC, as well as external agencies like the RVCA, which I believe is on this call, and a few other members of the public who were present at the meeting or provided written submissions. So we consider all of that feedback in finalizing the draft document. So at the very end of this process, you'll get a new and shiny zoning bylaw that I hope will be a good, usable tool for everyone. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this document that I'm presenting tonight, dated May 5th, is available on the Smiths Falls website at the link that you see on the screen. As I mentioned, it considered comments that we received from March 11th, when the first draft was released publicly. And the version that you will see online today is a redline version. So what it shows, and I think my next slide will show in more detail, is how the changes are represented since the March 11th version. So when I presented back in March, we were summarizing updates from the 94 existing zoning bylaw to March, and now I'm looking at what's happened in the last couple of months. So just something to note is the town, so Carl will be accepting comments on this version of the bylaw over the next couple of weeks. So the deadline for submission of written comments is Thursday, June 9th. Next slide. So for the panel members, this will probably look familiar to you. The layout of the zoning bylaw remains the same as what we presented back in March, meaning there are 27 sections, starting with the title in section 1, and that section also includes a new user guide to help readers navigate the document. The following sections include section 2, so administration and interpretation, section 3, definitions, so kind of commonly used terms throughout the document, as well as specific use definitions. Section 4 goes through various provisions pertaining to things such as accessory buildings, for example, as well as parking requirements. And then sections 5 through to 25 get into the 19 zones that make up this bylaw. Section 26 includes schedules or maps, as you'd know them to be. And there are 2 series of maps that I will go through in later slides. And the final section deals with approvals, and that will be finalized once this document is approved. Next slide. So as I mentioned, there are zoning schedules or maps that make up, that pair together with the text of the zoning bylaw document. And there are 2 types of schedules that we've called the A series and the B series. So I'll go through those right now. Next slide. So starting with the A series schedules, kind of your first step as far as navigating this document would be to look at the key map, Schedule A. which divides the town of Smiths Falls into kind of four quadrants, if you will, that then are represented as four separate schedules. So showing you kind of the finer detail of those areas of town and the zone codes that apply to all of the properties within that area. So each of the maps looks similar to what you see in the kind of bottom center of the slide, Schedule 1A. So red lines delineate the boundaries between zones. There's black bold text that has zone codes, and then there is the legend to the right that describes names what those codes are, so that you can easily find that information in the text of the bylaw. Next slide, please. So the B series schedules, they show special overlays, specifically the natural heritage overlay, which on the screen, I think you can clearly see in the green. And then there's the source water protection overlay. So once these, all of these schedules are finalized, so the text and the schedules are approved by your council, then these maps will make their way into the virtual realm. So they'll be you'll be able to navigate to the zoning of a particular property online. And so just a note here and throughout this presentation, if you do own property in town, please, I encourage you to take a look at whether the zoning on your property's changed. If you have any comments about what that means or any questions, please do feel free to reach out to the town with those within the next couple of weeks. Next slide. Okay, so this is, I'll just do a quick step-by-step guide on how to move through the zoning bylaw document using the schedules as well. So your starting point would be to look at the key map, so Schedule A, find which area of town the property is within, go to the zoomed in map for that area, locate the property, and find the zone code. So in the example on the slide, you can see the property outlined in orange has been given a CC code, which in the legend tells you that it's in a corridor commercial zone. So when you go into the text of the bylaw, you'll be looking through sections 4 to 25 to find the corridor commercial zoning provisions. Next slide. So kind of as you're navigating the specific zones section, it's good practice if there's any words that you don't understand to take a look back at section 3 for the definitions to explain to you what is meant by some of those terms, because it can get quite technical. And for, I guess, ease of, or to highlight those terms that have been defined, they have been capitalized throughout the document. So that will alert you to a defined term. And then it's also like, as far as the next step, once you've determined if there's, particular uses you were looking to see whether they or not they were permitted in that particular zone, and to what extent you could build on the property based on provisions such as the setbacks and the height and lot coverage, etc. Section 4 general provisions should also be referred to because that will give you more description of specific situations that you might run into. For example, if you're looking to put a shed on your property, you don't want to go into the accessory buildings section, and the parking provisions for all uses would also be found in section 4. Next slide. So once you're in the zone that's specific to your property, in this case, we're using the residential type 1 R1 zone as an example on the right-hand side. All zone sections look similarly in the sense that they have number one there, they have a header that tells you what section of the bylaw you're in. There's icons used to differentiate between sections. Following the title of the zone, there's a bit of a preamble, so it explains to you what the purpose of the zone is, followed by number 3 there, permitted uses. So those are usually separated out, at least in the case of the residential zones, into residential uses as well as non-residential uses that may be permitted. And then finally, number 4 there that you see in the table includes the performance standards. So things like setbacks, minimum lot area, lot frontages, heights, and those have all been provided in metric. Next slide. Okay, thank you, John. I'm assuming that's after this presentation. Okay. So there's another component to the zone sections, which are called exception zones. And those follow the main content of the zone. So an exception zone might come up for a specific property or a specific area. So we're in the R1, the residential 1 zone. And what you see on the screen is exception number 1 within that zone. So it has some additional considerations for a property on Lawrence Street in this case. So depending on where your property is, it may or may not be within an exception zone, but that would be noted on the Schedule A map. So you would see a code with a dash number following it that clues you into the fact that there's an exception to be considered. So we are working through these exception zones. Some have been removed as part of the update to the 94 bylaw because they were either implemented fully, so what was intended to be built as a result of that exception has been built, or it's outdated, no longer applicable. So we've done quite a bit of a cleanup of these exception zones to leave in place those that are absolutely necessary. Next zone. Sorry, next slide. And I'm getting a bit of feedback. I don't know if that's on my end, but if anyone is unmuted by chance and has some background noise, if they could check their mics, that'd be appreciated. Thank you. So just continuing on with exception zones. Here, there's another, I guess, potential item that you might see come up in a zone code, and it's a suffix lowercase h that indicates that the zone is within a holding zone. So a holding zone means that there are certain conditions that have been applied to that property. Screen example being 42 James Street, that have to be satisfied before you can change the zoning to remove the hold and proceed with the particular development that's permitted there. So what flags you to whether or not you're in a holding zone is the lowercase h, and that again would appear in both the exception zone code as well as on the Schedule A zone codes. Next slide, please. So as I had mentioned, there's a redlined version of the zoning bylaw that is available on Smith Falls website as well as Speak Up Smith Falls. So when you're going through that document, kind of your guide to seeing what has changed since we first presented the draft in March is to look for blue highlights where there is new information and red strikeouts for deletions. So in the example there, you can see how that is represented. Next slide. So now I'll move on to the key changes to the zoning bylaw itself from when we last met in March. So starting with general provisions, section 4.28, dealing with parking and loading area regulations. So there's a flat parking rate that's been applied to certain non-residential uses within 2 downtown zones. And I should add that they're newly created zones called the downtown core, so DC, as well as DF, downtown fringe zones. So the flat rate calls for 1 parking space for every 50 square meters of gross floor area within the DC and DF zones. And that's to allow, based on our conversations with the towns, with the town planning staff, to provide some flexibility when accommodating new developments, especially those containing commercial uses, because the comment that was made was that it's not always known precisely who the tenant will be at the time that plans are submitted to the town for review. The other thing to mention on downtown parking is we've maintained the 50% reduction for parking in the downtown core for all other non-permitted non-residential uses. So it's kind of an either or situation. You're either being covered by a flat rate if you're one of the uses that's specified. Otherwise, if not, and you're a commercial use located in the downtown, then you can cut your parking requirement in half based on what is shown as being required in section 4 of the bylaw. And then the final note is that we did add parking requirements for certain permitted uses where they may not have previously existed in the current bylaw. Next slide. So the other change affects the residential use zones, specifically lot standards. So there was some discussion at this committee in March over the minimum lot area requirements, specifically for singles and semi-detached dwellings. So what you can see on the screen is that we've from the March version, we've bumped those areas up slightly to a minimum of 420 square meters for single detached and 210 square meters per dwelling unit or per side of a semi-detached dwelling building. So these areas represent an increase from the first version of the bylaw that we presented in March, but they are slight reductions if compared to the original existing zoning bylaw of 94. Next slide, please. The other change of note is another residential change. So this is the introduction of 2 new types or forms of housing that have made their way into the market and have proven to be quite popular. So they are stacked townhouses as well as back-to-back townhouses. So The graphics on the right-hand side there kind of roughly demonstrate what they would look like. The idea with a stacked townhouse being is you would have units, a unit at ground floor with another unit sitting above it. In addition to that configuration kind of going down the row, whereas the back-to-back is kind of what the name implies. You would have units facing out towards different sides of the street with their back walls touching. And again, you would have a row of these types of units next to each other. So because this use didn't exist in the current, it doesn't exist in the current bylaw, we did have to create brand new provisions for what's reasonable as far as minimum lot areas, frontages, yard setbacks, coverage, height, etc. And these uses, I mean, I've summarized how they're defined, but specific language is included in section 3 to further distinguish them from each other, but also other residential uses. Next slide. So, so as not to limit the type of development that could occur in certain areas of town, we've added certain permitted uses to the zones that are listed on the screen. So those include the residential type 4 and residential type 5 zones. And one thing that I forgot to note on the last slide is that the back-to-back and stacked towns, you'll see those being permitted in the R4 zone, but also in the R3 zone. So just wanted to add that there. So as an example of some of the new uses that have been introduced to this list of zones, we've added small scale breweries as well as distilleries to the downtown waterfront zone, DW, as an example of a more, I guess for lack of a better word, modern use that we may not have seen back in 1994. Next slide, please. So there is a little bit of work left to do to get this document over the finish line. So as far as what you can anticipate seeing in that final draft before it goes to council would include, I mean, any changes that might come out of this meeting, as well as the 2-week comment period for public questions and comments to the town, but also we're still working to finalize some off-street parking requirements for certain uses in the downtown core, fringe, and waterfront zones, as those are new zones, and we want to make sure that we create a good foundation to work from. There will also be a maximum number of dwelling units added to the stacked and back-to-back townhouses. There'll be some provisions around a shelter use and adding that use to be permitted in the downtown and residential zones where multi-residential uses are permitted. And then there's some property-specific zoning that we need to address. Much of that would be seen in the exception zones, and it's specific to any correspondence we would have received to date with those affected property owners. And as well, there may be further comments coming from other departments at the town or external agencies. So anything that we do receive, we will try to make sure that it gets included in this final draft. Next slide. So that I'm now at the end of the presentation, and the floor is open to accept comments. And I think at this time, maybe I'll just give a general overview of how that's to go, unless Mr. Chair, you would prefer to provide that instruction.
No, I think you go ahead, Justine.
Okay, great. So if you do have a question or comment based on what you've heard tonight, there is a raise hand function that you'll find along the bottom of your screen to the right under reaction. So if you click on that little icon with the smiley face, you'll see the raise hand button there. And if you would prefer not to speak aloud and want to type your question or comment in, you can navigate to the chat function. And you also there, I believe, have the option to either send your question to everyone on this call or to a particular individual. So if you would just prefer to send a comment to Carl, let's say, the senior planner at the town, please feel free to do so. And I see a note here, Mr. Chair, that Ash is flagged to speak.
Okay, I'll, if Ash would like to speak now,
Sorry, Mr. Chair. Ash has logged out. I have his contact information and we'll follow up with him.
Okay, thanks, Mary. And there's no other public participations here or participants here, so I think I'll move to the committee for any comments from the committee. Stephen?
Yeah, I just had two quick comments for it. It was super small. It's just one that I saw as I was reading through on page 72. It says that, forget which of the sentence is about, but it says 5 and then it has 4 within the bracket. So it's just a typo to mention. And then I was wondering if I could ask some questions about the no requirement for bike parking or bike stations at hotels. Did we completely lose that, or was that moved somewhere else within the bylaw? Or was it, I know that the original one said that we needed 1 per unit inside the hotel. Is there an option to reduce that down to fewer, but still have some kind of bike parking at the hotels?
Okay, I do have the bylaw open. So if it's easy enough for me to navigate to that section of the bylaw to answer your question now, I'll do so. If it needs a little more thought, I might have to get back to you. But if you want to give me a moment to navigate to that area of the bylaw, go ahead. And I don't know if Mr. Chair, you wanted to move on to the next question while I do so.
Okay, is anyone else? Jay?
Yeah, I think that it was a great presentation, and the thing I like about this new zoning bylaw is it's user friendly, and so that's a really good aspect of it. And maybe Justine, if you could speak to, there's one stark sort of thing, and I brought it up I think in March as well. When we talk about 50% reduction in parking, can you speak to that again? Because I know that probably people are watching and thinking, well, we may maybe have already reduced the parking, but we want people in the downtown and have an availability. We're going to reduce it 50% more, and that's probably going to be their question. So if you could speak to that, it'd be great.
Thanks, Jay.
Yeah.
Justina?
Yes, thank you, Councillor and Chair, for the question. Yes, I remember your comment from back in March, and we did spend quite a bit of time kind of workshopping that, if you will, trying to think how to encourage, I suppose, development in the downtown or redevelopment without limiting it completely, but affording them opportunities for parking on the lot as opposed to on-street parking. So I think what the end results in this version of the bylaw you'll see is kind of a tweaking to those requirements. Now, just as a, I guess, a note, that 50% reduction was something that currently stands in the zoning. And I guess I'd have to defer to Carl or Mary as far as whether that reduction has been working for the town. If not, then we can look at it a little more aggressively and maybe consider removing that provision entirely if the concern is warrants that type of approach. And I see Carl has raised his hand to speak. So if you wanted to add anything.
Carl?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The 50% reduction has been certainly that's been something that's carried forward in the zoning bylaw, the current zoning bylaw for all non-residential uses in the downtown core, and it attempts to strike that careful balance between allowing or between requiring parking spaces, but also not requiring, but also recognizing that there are other spaces on the street available and elsewhere, and that we don't want to necessarily overbuild parking requirements, thereby creating a larger amount of hardened surface. So it is a provision that that certainly we have been using and have been applying as we've been seeing development applications through the core. It only, of course, applies for new commercial development. To the best of my knowledge, it has worked. I'm not aware of it being problematic. I like the approach that's being proposed in the new zoning bylaw of simplifying the requirements. I think the biggest challenge we have is when we're looking at evolution between different kinds of commercial uses that trigger additional parking requirements. Then we have to run those numbers and run those calculations. If somebody's looking to go from a restaurant to a retail, for instance, then potentially additional parking is required. Or then if the retail then goes back to a different restaurant, those are the sorts of areas where things get a little bit more complex. But in my mind and through my experience, the 50% parking reduction, I'm not aware of it having caused an operational issue within our downtown core. And based on what I've seen, my recommendation would be to retain it as recommended in the draft bylaw.
Thanks, Carl and Justina. Through the chair, I get that. I mean, there's only so much space to park a car in Smith Falls, so it is what it is. So, but I mean, I don't know if we need it in there to say that, because there's no other place to park. So, but thanks for the answer.
Thanks, Jay.
Mr. Chair, I do have a response for Stephen about the hotel bicycle parking.
Okay.
So it is shown, and perhaps it's a little confusing and how that update was represented. Stephen's correct. We had striked out the minimum parking, bicycle parking requirement for a hotel. So it was previously listed as 1 space per guest room. And we've chosen to capture it under the more general, broader term that's found at the bottom of table 4-7, specifically other non-residential uses. So the requirement there is 1 space per 1,000 square meters of floor area.
Stephen?
That's perfect. Thanks, Justina.
Any other questions? Carl?
And I would like to bring to the, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to bring to the committee's attention the downtown fringe zoning that's been proposed to cover some of the more mixed use areas on the outer edge of our downtown fringe area. So this was discussed in the last through the at the open house, and then at the last public meeting. Staff have circulated all property owners who are within that downtown fringe zone, and Mary and I have we've received feedback, or we've received inquiries from about 15 or so of the residents who've received that. So we've in those cases we've explained the rationale for why that zoning category is proposed, as well as the potential impact on accommodating additional residential intensification. Nobody has and we've also given people the opportunity, of course, to provide us formal written comments for council's consideration. We haven't been made aware of any outstanding concerns. Nobody's come back and objected to what we're doing. Most people seem to be comfortable with it once we've had that conversation. But I did want to let the committee know that we have had a fair amount of feedback on that, and and nothing has come back our way suggesting that that it's the wrong approach. So I just wanted to give the committee that heads up.
Thanks, Carl. Does Sarah want to speak at all? Do you know?
Hi, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. I did submit some additional comments today. They were just a follow-up to our original comments submitted, I guess, in early April regarding floodplain delineation and some restrictions for certain zone provisions. But I have spoken with Mary and Carl, and they suggested there would be a follow-up at a later point.
Thank you. Well, if there's no more questions, I think we can move on. Do you need a motion, Jay or Carl?
Mr. Chair,
Yeah,
just
Jay.
it sounds like it's ending up. Just so we could reiterate our steps forward, because there's still opportunity for people to comment and affect what we're doing here. So just so we can tell people there's still time to weigh in on this.
Yeah, well, the date that was on there, Justina, wasn't it June, or Carl, wasn't it June 9th?
So yes, Mr. Chair, the June 9th date was for written comments to the email address that you see there on the screen. So zoningreview@smithsfalls.ca. So that's a 2-week comment window from tonight to 2 weeks from now.
Yeah.
And then the previous slide has meeting dates. So there will be a presentation by Carl to the Committee of the Whole. So that's happening at the end of next month, June 27th. And then we're targeting July 4th for council adoption. And just a note there being that there is a 20-day appeal period. So depending on when the notice of decision goes out, from that date, you will be counting 20 days for any appeals that might come in. And should there not be any, then the bylaw will be in full force and effect after those 20 days are over.
Thanks for that.
Thanks, Justina.
Just to reiterate,
We'll move on to the closing here. I'd like to thank those attending and participating in the virtual public meeting for the comprehensive zoning bylaw review project. Any participants seeking additional information regarding process and encouragement to reach out to the senior planner and planning clerk. The public is reminded that the deadline to provide the comment on the draft zoning bylaw is June 9th, 2022. I'd like to thank Justina for her presentation.
Thank
This
you.
concludes the public open house portion of the Planning Advisory Committee meeting. We will now move on to the next item of our agenda. Priority issues. Do we have anything, Carl, there? Or
Not at the moment, Mr. Chair. It appears likely we will be looking for to schedule a public meeting for our regular June meeting. So I can certainly give and then perhaps at that meeting as well, if the committee would like, I can summarize, since that'll be around the time we've given as a deadline for additional feedback. I can summarize that feedback to the committee and perhaps look for a resolution from the committee with respect to the zoning bylaw and any potential modifications for what we're looking at.
so do you need a motion tonight, like from us for anything, or?
No, I think and Mary, you can jump in if you look at it procedurally differently than I do, or Justina, but I think tonight I view that as information gathering, and then perhaps in a couple of weeks we can look at a motion to move on to committee of the whole.
Okay, thanks, Carl.
Thank you.
Any project updates?
None at the moment, Mr. Chair.
Okay, our next advisory committee meeting is June the 9th, 2022. I have a motion for adjournment. Jay. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good
thank
night.
you. Good night.
Thank you.